In the ruthless, male-dominated world of ancient Rome, power was a game played by senators, generals, and emperors. It was a world of shifting allegiances, sharp daggers, and poisoned wine, where a woman's influence was typically confined to the shadows, wielded through her husband or her son. One woman shattered those conventions. She did not just influence power, she created it, molded it, and placed it upon the head of her own child. For that, he had her killed. This is the story of Agrippina the Younger, one of the most formidable women in Roman history. She was born into the heart of the empire's ruling family, the great-granddaughter of the first emperor Augustus himself. She endured exile at the hands of one emperor, her brother Caligula, only to return and claw her way to the center of power by marrying another, her uncle Claudius. Agrippina's ultimate goal was to see her son Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus ascend to the throne. We know him today by a more infamous name, Nero. Through years of careful scheming, strategic alliances, and what many historians believe to be cold-blooded murder, she succeeded. She maneuvered Nero into the position of heir, and upon Claudius's death, she made her 17-year-old son the most powerful man in the Roman world. She had achieved the impossible. She was the woman who had made an emperor. Her triumph, however, would be short-lived. The mother who had given her son everything soon became an obstacle he needed to remove. Part 1. A Dangerous Heritage. The early life of an imperial heiress. To understand Agrippina the Younger, you have to understand the environment she was born into. It was a world of immense privilege and even greater danger. Her blood was a claim to power, and in imperial Rome, a claim to power was often a death sentence. Agrippina was born on November 6, 15 AD, in a military outpost on the Rhine frontier in what is now modern-day Cologne, Germany. She was a blue-blooded Roman aristocrat, a direct descendant of the two men who had founded the Roman Empire. On one side, she was the great-granddaughter of the first emperor, Augustus. He was the architect of the Roman imperial system, a figure revered as a near deity, the man who had brought peace and stability after a century of civil war. This connection alone made her a member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the ruling family of Rome. It was her other lineage, through her father, that was perhaps even more potent in the eyes of the public. Her father was Germanicus, Julius Caesar. To the Roman people and, more importantly, to the legions, Germanicus was a hero. He was the adopted son of the reigning emperor Tiberius and was widely seen as the ideal Roman, a brilliant and successful general, handsome, charismatic, and virtuous. He was immensely popular for his military victories in Germania, avenging the humiliating loss of 3 Roman legions years earlier. He was the Roman people's champion, the man everyone expected would one day succeed Tiberius and restore the glory days of Augustus. Agrippina's mother was equally formidable. Agrippina the Elder, as she is known to history, was a woman of unshakable pride and fierce determination. She was Augustus's granddaughter and was known for her devotion to her husband, Germanicus, whom she often accompanied on his dangerous military campaigns along with their children. She was a symbol of Roman matronly virtue, but she was also politically astute and unafraid to speak her mind, a trait that would earn her powerful enemies. Agrippina the Younger was one of 9 children born to this golden couple, though only 6 survived into adulthood. She and her siblings, including her infamous younger brother Gaius, better known as Caligula, were celebrities from birth. They were the children of the most beloved man in the empire. This illustrious heritage, however, was a double-edged sword. While it gave her prestige, it also placed her and her family directly in the crosshairs of imperial politics. The reigning emperor, Tiberius, was a stark contrast to the popular Germanicus. He was aging, reclusive, and deeply paranoid. He had retired to the island of Capri, ruling from a distance through his trusted and notoriously ruthless Praetorian prefect, Lucius Aelius Sejanus. Sejanus saw the popular family of Germanicus as a direct threat to his own power and influence over the emperor. He began to systematically poison Tiberius's mind against them. The first tragedy struck when Agrippina was just 4 years old. In the year 19 AD, her heroic father, Germanicus, died suddenly and mysteriously in Antioch. He was only 33 years old. On his deathbed, he openly accused the governor of Syria, Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, of poisoning him on the orders of Emperor Tiberius and Sejanus. Whether this was true or not is still debated by historians, but it was what the Roman people believed. The death of their hero sent a shockwave of grief and suspicion through the empire. His widow, Agrippina the Elder, returned to Rome with her husband's ashes, publicly mourning and making it clear that she held the emperor responsible. This was an incredibly bold and dangerous move. It was a direct challenge to Tiberius's authority, and it set her on a collision course with the imperial court. For her children, including the young Agrippina, their father's death marked the end of their innocence. They were now the orphans of a beloved martyr, a constant and uncomfortable reminder of the emperor's potential tyranny. Their lives were no longer their own, they were symbols in a deadly political game. The years that followed were a brutal lesson in survival. Agrippina watched as Sejanus, with the emperor's blessing, moved to dismantle her family. Her mother, Agrippina the Elder, became the primary target. Her pride and refusal to remain silent made her an easy mark. Sejanus and his allies began a campaign of slander, accusing her of arrogance and treasonous ambition. One by one, those loyal to Germanicus's family were targeted, prosecuted on trumped-up charges, and eliminated. The storm finally broke in the year 29 AD. Agrippina was about 14 years old when her mother and her oldest brother, Nero Caesar, were arrested on charges of treason. Her brother was exiled to the island of Ponza and was driven to suicide or starved to death a year later. Her mother was sent to the island of Pandateria, the same barren rock where her own mother, Julia the Elder, had been exiled by Augustus. She would die there a few years later, allegedly from starvation after refusing to eat. Agrippina's second oldest brother, Drusus Caesar, was also arrested and imprisoned in the dungeons of the Palatine Hill in Rome, where he too would starve to death. Agrippina was a teenager and witnessed her family being systematically destroyed. Her father, a national hero, dead under suspicious circumstances. Her mother and two older brothers were arrested, exiled, and killed by the state. She was left in the care of her great-grandmother Livia and later her grandmother Antonia, living under the constant shadow of the emperor's paranoia. Every word, friendship, and action could be twisted and used against her. This was the environment in which Agrippina the Younger came of age. It was a crucible of fear and uncertainty that would forge her into the shrewd and ruthless political operator she would become. She learned from a very young age that to be a member of the imperial family was to have a target on your back. She learned that sentiment was a luxury, that trust was a weakness, and that survival depended on cunning, patience, and a willingness to do whatever it takes. In this atmosphere of terror, a path to survival was laid out for her. In the year 28 AD, just before the purges against her family began in earnest, Tiberius arranged her marriage. She was only 13 years old. Her husband was Gnaeus Domitius, a Ahenobarbus. The Ahenobarbi were an ancient and wealthy noble family, but her husband was by all accounts a deeply unpleasant man. The historian Suetonius describes him as a man detestable in every aspect of his life, known for his recklessness, his violence, and his financial dishonesty. He was said to have once deliberately run over a child with his chariot on the Appian Way and to have gouged out a man's eye in the Roman Forum for criticizing him. For Agrippina, this marriage was not about love or companionship. It was a political necessity. Marrying into a prominent family outside her own direct Julio-Claudian line provided a degree of protection. It made her a slightly less obvious target for the paranoid Tiberius. For 9 years, she navigated this marriage and the treacherous final years of Tiberius's reign. Then, in 37 AD, everything changed. Tiberius died on Capri, and the throne passed to the sole surviving son of Germanicus, Agrippina's younger brother, Gaius, who would enter history with the nickname Caligula. Initially, Caligula's ascension was a moment of triumph and relief for Agrippina. At 22 years old, she was suddenly no longer the daughter of a suspected traitor, but the sister of the emperor. Caligula, eager to capitalize on the public's enduring love for his father, Germanicus, showered his 3 surviving sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Julia Livilla, with unprecedented honors. He made them Vestal virgins, included their names in the official oaths of loyalty taken by the Senate and the army, and had their images minted on coins alongside his own. For the first time, living women of the imperial family were being publicly celebrated on Roman coinage, a sign of their extraordinary status. During this period, Agrippina was at the center of the imperial court. She was young, beautiful, and the emperor's sister. This was also the year she gave birth to her only child, a son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. This was the boy who would one day become the Emperor Nero. With his birth, Agrippina was no longer just a political pawn. She was now the mother of a potential heir, a boy with the blood of Augustus in his veins. This dramatically increased her own importance and, no doubt, her own ambition. The sunny days of Caligula's early reign did not last. The new emperor, invested with absolute power at the age of 24, quickly revealed himself to be erratic, megalomaniacal, and dangerously unstable. His behavior became increasingly bizarre and tyrannical. He executed rivals on a whim, declared himself a living god, and engaged in scandalous affairs, including, according to some sources, incestuous relationships with his sisters. His beloved sister Drusilla died in 38 AD, an event that seemed to push him further into madness. Agrippina, ever the pragmatist, understood that her proximity to such an unpredictable ruler was as dangerous as her previous distance from Tiberius. Her favor was entirely dependent on her brother's whims. In the year 39 AD, her world came crashing down once more. Caligula claimed to have uncovered a plot against his life. The supposed ringleaders were his brother-in-law, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who was the widower of the deceased Drusilla and the commander of the Roman army in Germany. Shockingly, Caligula also accused his two surviving sisters, Agrippina and Julia Livilla, of being part of the conspiracy and of having adulterous affairs with Lepidus. Lepidus was executed immediately. Agrippina and Julia were stripped of their honors, their property was confiscated, and they were exiled to the desolate Pontian Islands, the same small islands where their mother and brother had perished. Agrippina was forced to perform a humiliating ritual, carrying the ashes of the executed Lepidus in an urn all the way back to Rome. Her young son, Nero, just 2 years old, was taken from her and sent to be raised by his paternal aunt, Domitia Lepida. For the second time in her life, Agrippina had lost everything. She was a political outcast, living on a barren island, her son taken from her, her fate once again in the hands of an unstable tyrant. Her first taste of power had been brief and had ended in disaster. Her time in exile would not be wasted. It was there, in the quiet desolation of the islands, that she would have had time to reflect on the lessons of her tumultuous life. She had learned from her mother's fate that open defiance was fatal. She had learned from her own experience with Caligula that relying on the favor of a single man was a fool's game. Power had to be taken and secured. She had seen firsthand how quickly fortunes could turn in Rome. Her time as an exile was just another chapter in her education. She was biding her time, waiting for the political winds to shift once more, as she knew they inevitably would. Her ambition had been sharpened. The next time an opportunity arose, she would be ready. Part 2. The Path to Power, Marriages and Machinations. For 2 years, Agrippina endured her exile on the Pontian Islands, a political non-entity stripped of her status and her sum. She was a survivor, biding her time, but her fate was completely out of her hands. Then, in January of the year 41 AD, the political winds in Rome didn't just shift, they erupted into a hurricane. Her brother, the Emperor Caligula, his wife, and his infant daughter were assassinated in a conspiracy involving officers of the Praetorian Guard and several senators. The tyrant was dead. His murder plunged Rome into chaos. The Senate, emboldened by the power vacuum, began to dream of restoring the old republic, of a Rome without emperors. But they had forgotten who truly held power in the new Rome. The soldiers. While the senators debated, the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who served as the emperor's personal bodyguards, were busy securing their own future. They knew that a restored republic would likely mean their disbandment. They needed an emperor, one who would owe his throne and his gratitude to them. Ransacking the imperial palace, a group of guardsmen reportedly found a 50-year-old man hiding behind a curtain, trembling in fear for his life. This was Tiberius Claudius Drusus, the brother of the great hero Germanicus and the uncle of both the murdered Caligula and the exiled Agrippina. Claudius had been the family's afterthought of 5 decades. Afflicted with a limp, a stammer, and various physical tics, He was long considered an embarrassment, a weak-minded fool who was largely ignored and kept out of public life. His perceived incompetence had been his salvation. While others were purged by Tiberius and Caligula, Claudius was deemed too harmless to be a threat. The Praetorians saw him as the perfect puppet. They swept him up, carried him to their camp, and proclaimed him emperor. The Senate, faced with the swords of the guard, had no choice but to acquiesce. For Agrippina, the news of her brother's assassination and her uncle's unexpected ascension was a miracle. Claudius had always been fond of her, and one of his first acts as emperor was to signal a break from Caligula's tyranny. He recalled his two surviving nieces, Agrippina and Julia Livilla, from exile. After 2 years of disgrace, Agrippina was back in Rome. She returned to a city transformed. She was now the emperor's niece, but she was in a precarious position. She was 25 years old, her first husband was dead, and her property had been confiscated by Caligula. Her son, Nero, now 3 years old, had been raised by his aunt and barely knew her. She had her name and her bloodline, but she had no wealth and no independent power base. She knew she was vulnerable. In the snake pit of the imperial court, a single woman with a direct claim to the throne was a target. She needed protection, she needed influence, and above all, she needed money. The most direct path to all three for a Roman noblewoman was marriage. Agrippina did not choose a husband for love. She chose one for power. Her target was Gaius Sallustius Crispus Passienus. Crispus was one of the most formidable men in Rome. He was enormously wealthy, famously witty and politically powerful, having already served as consul twice. An alliance with him would instantly restore Agrippina's financial security and place her back at the center of Roman high society. There was just one problem. Crispus was already married. His wife was Domitia Lepida, the same aunt who had raised Nero for the past 2 years. For Agrippina, this was simply an obstacle to be removed. The historical sources don't tell us exactly how she did it, but they give us clues. She was known to be incredibly charming and persuasive when she wanted to be. She was also an imperial princess, the emperor's own niece. She likely used all her powers of seduction and political calculation to convince Crispus that she was the far better prize. A marriage to her would bring him closer to the emperor and the heart of power. Whatever her methods, they worked. Crispus divorced his wife Domitia and married Agrippina shortly after her return. With this single strategic move, Agrippina had completely rehabilitated her position. She was no longer a vulnerable exile, but the wife of a respected and wealthy consular. Her son, Nero, was returned to her care, and with Crispus's vast fortune now at her disposal, his future was secure. For the next several years, Agrippina played the part of the respectable Roman matron. She avoided the overt political maneuvering that had led to her first downfall. She watched, she listened, and she learned, carefully rebuilding her network of allies within the Roman elite. She paid close attention to the woman who now occupied the position she craved most, the empress. The empress was Valeria Messalina, Claudius's third wife. She was much younger than the emperor, barely 20 years old when he took the throne, and she had a reputation for being as ruthless as she was promiscuous. While Claudius, who was actually a surprisingly capable administrator, was busy running the empire, Messalina was busy consolidating her own power. She held a firm grip on the aging emperor and used her influence to eliminate anyone she perceived as a threat, either through exile or execution. She was also, according to the Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, driven by an insatiable sexual appetite, engaging in numerous affairs and even, as the story goes, working a shift in a local brothel to satisfy her desires. Messalina had also given Claudius 2 children, a daughter named Octavia, and more importantly, a son and heir named Britannicus. As long as Messalina was empress and Britannicus was the designated heir, Agrippina's own ambitions for her son Nero were blocked. Agrippina was intelligent enough to know that a direct confrontation with the reigning empress would be suicide. Messalina had already eliminated Agrippina's sister, Julia Livilla, on trumped-up charges of adultery. Agrippina knew she could be next, so she played a brilliant waiting game. She presented herself as a model of quiet dignity and modesty, a stark contrast to the flamboyant and reckless Messalina. She knew that a woman as impulsive as Messalina would, sooner or later, make a fatal mistake. She just had to be patient. In the year 48 AD, Messalina didn't just make a mistake, she committed an act of such staggering audacity that it sealed her fate. While her husband, the Emperor Claudius, was away from Rome officiating a ceremony at the port of Ostia, Messalina decided to marry her lover, the handsome senator Gaius Silius. This wasn't just an affair. They signed a formal marriage contract and held a public wedding ceremony, complete with guests and celebrations. Historians are still baffled by her motives. Was it a genuine attempt at a coup, to depose Claudius and place Silius on the throne? Or was it simply the ultimate act of a reckless woman who believed she was untouchable? Whatever the reason, it was treason. At first, the emperor's powerful inner circle of freedmen, former slaves who now ran the imperial bureaucracy, were too afraid to tell him. Finally, the most powerful of them, a man named Narcissus, went to Claudius and revealed the entire affair. The indecisive and terrified emperor was finally spurred to action. Silius and many of the wedding guests were arrested and executed. Messalina was detained in the gardens of Lucullus, and after a brief period of imperial indecision, Narcissus sent an officer to kill her without waiting for a direct order. The empress was dead. The position was now open. The Emperor Claudius, now nearing 60, announced that he had been so unlucky in marriage that he would never marry again. His powerful freedmen, Narcissus, Callistus, and Pallas, knew better. They knew that Claudius needed a wife to manage the imperial household and to protect him from further conspiracies. Each of them knew that whoever chose the next empress would gain immense power. A competition began. Each of the three powerful freedmen backed a different candidate. Now Agrippina made her move. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Her second husband, Crispus, had died a year earlier, leaving her his immense fortune and making her an independently wealthy woman. She was single, she was a mother, and she had the most powerful claim of all. Her ally in the court was the freedman Pallas, who was rumored to be her lover. Pallas argued her case passionately to Claudius. Her advantages were overwhelming. She was, after all, his own niece, the daughter of his beloved brother Germanicus. A marriage to her would unite the two main branches of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. She was a mature woman in her mid-30s. She was a proven fertile mother, and Pallas argued that she could be trusted to act as a guardian to Claudius's own children, Octavia and Britannicus. Agrippina herself used her family connection to her advantage. As his niece, she had easy and frequent access to Claudius, and she used her considerable charms to seduce him. There was, however, one enormous social and legal barrier. A marriage between an uncle and a niece was considered incestuous in Roman society. It was profoundly taboo. For a woman as determined as Agrippina, this was simply a problem to be solved. She and Pallas launched a carefully orchestrated campaign. They bribed a prominent senator to raise the issue in the Senate, arguing that this marriage was a matter of state security. The senator gave a glowing speech, praising Agrippina's virtues and arguing that the union was vital for the stability of the empire. The intimidated Senate dutifully agreed, passing a special law to permit the marriage. A crowd was even arranged outside the Senate House to clamor their approval. In the year 49 AD, Agrippina the Younger married her uncle, the Emperor Claudius. From the disgrace of exile, she had schemed and maneuvered her way to the absolute apex of power. She was no longer just the emperor's niece, she was the Empress of Rome. The title she had won was Augusta, a prestigious honorific previously granted only to Livia, the wife of Augustus, and only in his will after his death. Agrippina was granted the title while her husband was still alive, a clear signal of the unprecedented power she intended to wield. She had reached the throne. For Agrippina, becoming empress was the final, crucial step in achieving her true ambition, placing her son on it. Part 3. Engineering an Emperor. The rise of Nero. The moment Agrippina became the wife of Claudius, she began to operate with a speed and precision that left the Roman court breathless. She understood her new position as but a staging ground for the most audacious political project of her life, making her son emperor. She had watched other imperial women like Livia and her own mother wield influence from the shadows. She had seen her predecessor, Messalina, use her power capriciously to destroy personal enemies and satisfy her whims. Agrippina would be different. Her ambition was singular, her methods systematic. She would not just influence power, she would architect it. Her first move was to solidify her own status. She convinced Claudius to grant her the title of Augusta, a supreme honor that even Livia, the revered wife of Augustus, had only received posthumously in her husband's will. For a living empress to hold this title was unprecedented. It elevated her from the emperor's consort to his virtual partner in rule. She was no longer just Agrippina, she was Agrippina Augusta, a name that carried immense weight and authority. She began to appear at public ceremonies, receive envoys, and even had a city in her birthplace in Germania, renamed in her honor, Colonia Claudia Ara Agrippinensium, the city we know today as Cologne. This was a clear message to the world. She was a ruler in her own right. With her own position secured, she began a ruthless and systematic purge of any potential rivals. She had seen how quickly allegiances could shift, and she was determined to be the only center of female power in the court. A wealthy woman named Lollia Paulina, who had been a rival candidate to marry Claudius, was driven to suicide on trumped-up charges of practicing black magic. Another noblewoman, Calpurnia, was exiled simply because the emperor had complimented her beauty. Agrippina was creating a vacuum around the emperor that only she could fill. But her most critical move was aimed at the true kingmakers of Rome, the Praetorian Guard. She had seen how they had put her uncle on the throne, and she knew they could just as easily unmake him or his successor. The two Praetorian prefects in command were loyal to the memory of Messalina and, by extension, to her son Britannicus. They were a threat to Agrippina's plans. So, she convinced Claudius that the command of the guard was more efficient when unified under a single prefect. The two commanders were dismissed, and in their place, Agrippina installed her own man, Sextus Afranius Burrus. Burrus was a brilliant choice. He was a stern, respected military man of immense capability and integrity. He was not a court schemer, which made him appear trustworthy. His defining feature was his absolute loyalty to the woman who had given him his command. With Burrus in charge of the Praetorians, Agrippina now controlled the 9,000 elite soldiers stationed in Rome. She held the city and the emperor's life in her hands. Now, she could turn her full attention to her son. In the year 50 AD, Agrippina persuaded the 60-year-old Claudius to take the most significant step of all, to formally adopt her 12-year-old son. Overnight, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus ceased to exist. He was renamed Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. The name was a masterstroke of propaganda, linking him to the Claudian family, to the heroic Germanicus, and to the legacy of Caesar. More importantly, as Claudius's adopted son, he was now legally on par with Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. Crucially, Nero was 3 years older. In the Roman system of succession, this gave him a decisive advantage. To shape her son into a plausible future emperor, Agrippina knew he needed the right guidance. She recalled from exile one of the most brilliant minds in Rome, the Stoic philosopher and writer Lucius Annaeus Seneca. Seneca had been banished years earlier, implicated in a scandal involving Agrippina's late sister. By bringing him back and making him Nero's tutor, Agrippina achieved 2 goals. First, she placed her son under the tutelage of a respected intellectual who could polish his image and prepare him for the duties of rule. Second, she earned Seneca's undying gratitude. Like Burrus, Seneca's career and fortune were now inextricably linked to the success of Agrippina and her son. Together, Burrus the soldier and Seneca the statesman would become the 2 most important allies in her quest for power. With Nero's legal status and education secured, Agrippina began a relentless public relations campaign. Every opportunity was taken to promote Nero while simultaneously diminishing Britannicus. Nero was paraded before the public in triumphal processions. In the year 51 AD, at the age of just 14, he was granted the toga virilis, the toga of manhood, marking his official entry into public life. Claudius designated him proconsul, giving him authority outside of Rome, and announced that he would serve as consul in his 20th year. He was constantly in the public eye, his name on everyone's lips. Meanwhile, Britannicus, the emperor's natural son, was systematically sidelined. He was kept in the nursery, dressed as a child, and treated as a junior. Tacitus tells a poignant story of a court ceremony where Nero appeared in the triumphal robes of a general, while Britannicus was present in the simple toga of a boy. The contrast was deliberate and devastating, signaling to the entire Roman elite where the future of the empire lay. The final piece of Agrippina's puzzle was to bind her son to Claudius's own bloodline. She arranged for Nero to be betrothed to Claudius's daughter, Octavia. Octavia was Britannicus's sister, and by marrying her, Nero would effectively become Claudius's son-in-law as well as his adopted son, further cementing his claim to the throne. The marriage took place in the year 53 AD. Nero was 16, Octavia was about 13. The net around the imperial throne, so carefully woven by Agrippina, was now complete. Nero was the adopted son, the son-in-law, the designated successor, and the popular favorite. Britannicus was an afterthought. By the year 54 AD, Agrippina's victory seemed absolute. But then, a dangerous shift occurred. The aging emperor Claudius, perhaps finally realizing how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered, began to show signs of regret. The historian Tacitus reports that he was overheard speaking affectionately of his son Britannicus, lamenting how his own child had been pushed aside. He was heard to mutter that it was time for the boy to be given the toga of manhood, and that he would give the Roman people their true heir. For Agrippina, these were a death threat to her entire life's work. She knew Claudius's fickle nature. She knew that he could undo everything with a single decree or a new will. All her planning could be destroyed if Claudius lived long enough to change his mind. She decided he would not get the chance. The date was October 13th, 54 AD. Claudius was attending a banquet on the Palatine Hill. One of his favorite dishes was mushrooms. Agrippina, according to our sources, procured a particularly fine specimen and had it laced with a potent poison, prepared by a notorious specialist named Locusta. She served the dish to her husband herself, a final, intimate act of betrayal. The poison worked, but not perfectly. Claudius began to suffer horribly, his bowels in agony, but he was not dying. He was either trying to vomit up the poison or it was being expelled from his system. Agrippina could not afford a witness who survived a poisoning attempt. She had a backup plan. She signaled to the emperor's doctor, a Greek named Xenophon, who was in on the plot. Xenophon rushed to the emperor's side, claiming he would help him vomit by tickling the back of his throat with a feather, a common medical practice. But the feather Xenophon used had been dipped in a second, faster-acting poison. This time, there was no mistake. The 63-year-old emperor Claudius was dead. Even in this moment of high drama, Agrippina's cool-headed planning was evident. Immediately following the emperor's death, the palace was sealed. His passing was kept a closely guarded secret. Agrippina made a show of grieving, embracing Britannicus and his sisters, keeping them close and effectively under house arrest, while she and Burrus made their final preparations. She waited for hours, until midday, which astrologers had deemed the most auspicious time to announce a new reign. At the chosen hour, the palace gates swung open. Nero, now 17 years old, emerged into the daylight. He was not alone. At his side was the formidable figure of Afranius Burrus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Burrus escorted the young man directly to the Praetorian camp. There, before the assembled soldiers, a short speech was made, and the promise of a massive financial bonus was given. The soldiers, loyal to the commander Agrippina had given them, raised their shields and their voices, proclaiming Nero, the new emperor of Rome. The Senate, presented with a fait accompli and with the Praetorians' choice already made, had no option but to formally confer all the titles and powers of emperor onto the teenager. It was a flawless coup d'état, executed with chilling efficiency. Agrippina had achieved the impossible. She had survived exile, navigated the deadly politics of 3 imperial reigns, and through sheer force of will, placed her own son on the throne. At the age of 39, Agrippina Augusta was now the most powerful woman in the Roman world, the mother of the emperor she had created. As she stood at the pinnacle of her power, she must have believed that her future, and Nero's, was finally secure, controlled, and directed by her. It would prove to be her greatest miscalculation. Part 4. The Emperor's Mother. A power struggle begins. With her 17-year-old son Nero, now Emperor of Rome, Agrippina had reached the zenith of her power. In the initial months of his reign, her influence was displayed for all to see. This was not the subtle behind-the-scenes power wielded by previous imperial women. This was open, unapologetic, and in many ways revolutionary. She was not merely the emperor's mother, she positioned herself as his co-ruler, the senior partner in a new imperial enterprise. The first coins minted under Nero's rule made this dynamic explicit. On one side was the head of the young emperor, on the other was the portrait of his mother, Agrippina Augusta. Initially, their portraits were face-to-face as equals. Later coins went even further, showing her portrait on the front, the obverse side, with her titles more prominent than her son's, who was relegated to the back. This was a shocking break with Roman tradition. The coinage of the empire was a powerful tool of state propaganda, and it was now broadcasting the message that a woman was at the heart of imperial authority. Her involvement went far beyond symbolic gestures. The historian Cassius Dio tells us that she attempted to attend meetings of the Senate, the ancient heart of Roman political life. She would listen to their debates from behind a curtain, a physical manifestation of her presence and oversight. On one occasion, when Nero was receiving an embassy from Armenia, Agrippina entered the chamber and moved to ascend the dais to sit beside him, an act that would have placed her on equal footing with the emperor in the conduct of foreign affairs. This was a step too far, even for her allies. Her son's advisor, the philosopher Seneca, in a moment of quick thinking, whispered to Nero to get up and go greet his mother, transforming a potential constitutional crisis into a public display of filial piety. The message was clear. Agrippina saw herself as an empress in her own right. She managed the imperial finances, vetted appointments, and dictated policy. For a brief, shining moment, she was arguably the most powerful person in Rome. In achieving her ultimate ambition, Agrippina had sown the seeds of her own destruction. She had raised her son to be a vessel for her own power, but she had failed to account for the intoxicating effect that absolute authority would have on a 17-year-old boy. Nero, who had spent his life under the thumb of his formidable mother, was now the emperor. He was surrounded by people who told him he was a living god, that his every whim was law. He had Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus to guide him, two men who, while owing their careers to Agrippina, also understood that for Nero's reign to be stable, he needed to be seen as the true source of power. A slow, subtle campaign began to pry the young emperor away from his mother's control. The first cracks in their relationship appeared over matters of the heart. Nero was married to the virtuous but plain Octavia, a marriage his mother had arranged for purely political reasons. He had no affection for her. Instead, he became infatuated with a woman named Claudia Acte. Acte was everything Octavia was not. She was a former slave from Asia Minor, beautiful, sophisticated, and utterly outside the claustrophobic world of Roman high politics. Nero fell deeply in love with her. For Agrippina, this was a rebellion. Nero's affair with a freed woman was an insult to his imperial dignity and a direct challenge to her authority. Who was this former slave to command the affections of the emperor she had created? She confronted Nero with the full force of her famous temper, berating him, reminding him of everything she had done for him. She saw Acta as a symbol of the new influences seeping into his life, influences she could not control. Her rage backfired spectacularly. The more she railed against the affair, the more she drove Nero into Acte's arms and into the sympathetic counsel of Seneca, who advised a more moderate approach, seeing the affair as a harmless diversion. For the first time, Nero openly defied his mother, and he got away with it. He began to taste the freedom that came with his position. The power struggle escalated. Frustrated by her waning influence, Agrippina made a fateful error in judgment. She tried to reassert her control by reminding Nero that he was not the only option. She still had a pawn to play: Britannicus. Claudius's biological son was now about 14 years old and approaching manhood. He was a direct descendant of Claudius and a potential rallying point for any opposition to Nero. Agrippina began to drop hints, threatening Nero that she would take the true-born son to the Praetorian camp and declare him the rightful emperor. She would show the world, she raged, what a crippled and maimed dynasty looked like, a clear jab at her own maneuverings to secure the throne. Whether she was serious or was simply trying to terrify Nero back into submission, we will never know. For Nero, this was a threat he could not ignore. The quiet, sidelined boy in the palace was now a loaded weapon pointed directly at his throne, and his own mother was holding it. The threat to Britannicus was now extreme. In February of the year 55 AD, during a banquet of the palace, the threat was neutralized. The story, as told by Tacitus, is chilling. The young Britannicus was at dinner with Nero, Agrippina, and other members of the court. A cup of wine was brought to him, but it was served scalding hot. This was a deliberate setup. When Britannicus recoiled from the heat, cold water was added to the cup. But the water had been mixed with a fast-acting and deadly poison. Britannicus drank from the cup, and the effect was immediate. He lost his voice, struggled to breathe, and collapsed. The dinner party erupted in panic. Some guests fled, while others, more politically astute, froze, their eyes fixed on Nero. The emperor, with a coolness that shocked everyone, simply remarked that the boy was having one of his epileptic fits, something he had supposedly suffered from since childhood. While Britannicus lay dying on the floor, Nero calmly resumed his meal. Agrippina was reportedly just as shocked and terrified as everyone else. In that moment, she must have realized two horrifying truths. First, that her son was capable of cold-blooded murder. Second, that the game had changed. Her threats were no longer a tool of control, they were a trigger for lethal action. She had lost her final trump card, and she now knew with chilling certainty that her own son was a monster. The murder of Britannicus was a point of no return. Agrippina was now isolated. Seneca and Burrus, perhaps horrified by the murder, but more pragmatic about the need for a stable government, consolidated their control over the state, effectively running the empire in Nero's name. They systematically excluded Agrippina from state affairs. Her face was removed from new coin issues. The guards who had attended her as the emperor's mother were dismissed. She was eventually forced to leave the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill and move into a separate residence, the former home of her grandmother Antonia. When she walked out of the palace gates, she was no longer the empress mother, the co-ruler of the Roman world. She was a private citizen. She had lost her grip on the levers of power, and more importantly, she had lost her grip on her son. But Agrippina was still Agrippina. Even in her political exile, she remained a potent symbol. She was still the daughter of Germanicus, a living link to the golden age of Augustus. Disaffected senators and nobles who were unhappy with Nero's increasingly extravagant behavior began to visit her home, paying their respects. She was becoming a focal point for a silent opposition. Nero, now indulging in his passions for music, chariot racing, and a nightlife that scandalized the Roman elite, saw his mother's continued presence as a constant, silent rebuke. His paranoia, a trait he shared with his uncle Caligula, began to grow. He was haunted by the image of his powerful, disapproving mother. Seneca and Burrus may have been able to contain her politically, but they could not erase her from Nero's mind. The bond between mother and son, once a partnership of ambition, had curdled into a toxic mix of resentment, fear, and guilt. Nero began to believe that as long as his mother was alive, he would never be truly emperor. The woman who had given him the world was now the one thing standing in his way. Just as he had dealt with the threat of Britannicus, he began to contemplate how he might deal with the threat of his mother. The final, tragic act of their relationship was about to begin. Part 5. The Fall of a Titan, Murder and Legacy. By the year 59 AD, the fragile truce between Nero and his mother had completely disintegrated. Agrippina, living in her separate residence, was a constant, looming presence in Nero's life, a symbol of the old guard, a reminder of his debt to her, and a silent judge of his increasingly erratic behavior. The emperor, now 21 years old, was growing more confident in his own power and was deeply entangled with his new mistress, the ambitious and beautiful Poppaea or Sabina. Poppaea reportedly detested Agrippina, seeing her as the primary obstacle to her own ambition of becoming empress. She continually goaded Nero, mocking him as a child still ruled by his mother and urging him to rid himself of her for good. Nero, paranoid and resentful, finally came to a decision. His mother had to die, but how to kill the daughter of Germanicus, a woman still held in some reverence by the people in the army? A simple execution or a straightforward poisoning, like the one that had dispatched Britannicus, was too risky. It would look like what it was, a blatant act of matricide. Nero wanted a death that could be plausibly explained away as an accident. He needed a plan that was both clever and deniable. What he and his advisors devised was a plot so elaborate and bizarre It sounds like something out of a theatrical play. The plan was set for the festival of the Minerva at Baiae, a luxurious resort town on the Bay of Naples favored by the Roman elite. Nero knew his mother would be at her nearby villa. He began the operation with a calculated display of affection, a complete reversal of his recent coldness. He sent her letters filled with warmth, inviting her to the festival, insisting they must reconcile. Agrippina, a master of intrigue herself, was suspicious. She had survived the imperial court for over 40 years. She knew the danger of a sudden change of heart, yet she also knew the danger of refusing the emperor's invitation. Perhaps she held on to a sliver of hope that a real reconciliation was possible. She accepted. Nero welcomed her with an elaborate performance of filial devotion. He embraced her, hosted a lavish banquet in her honor, and seated her in the place of highest distinction. He was charming, attentive, and spoke to her with a familiarity she had not heard in years. As the evening wore on and the wine flowed, he prolonged the banquet late into the night. When it was finally time for her to return to her own villa across the bay, Nero escorted her to the docks. There, a special boat was waiting for her, more ornate and beautifully decorated than her own. This, he said, was a gift, a symbol of their renewed bond. He kissed her eyes and her hands and bid her farewell. This boat was a masterpiece of malevolent engineering. It had been secretly designed by Nero's freedman, Anicetus, the prefect of the fleet at Misenum. A section of the canopy above the main cabin had been weighted with a massive amount of lead, and the entire structure was designed to collapse on command, crushing those below. The hull itself was also rigged to break apart and sink. The plan was for the boat to row out into the calm, moonlit bay, and then, far from shore, the crew would trigger the mechanism. Agrippina would be crushed and drowned, the sea would hide the evidence, and the story would be a tragic accident. As the boat pulled away from the shore, Agrippina lay on a couch in the cabin, relaxing with two of her companions. One, her attendant Asaronia, sat at the foot of the couch, happily chattering about the emperor's change of heart and their reconciliation. The other, a man named Crepareus Gallus, stood nearby. The sea was calm, the sky was starry. Then, at the designated spot, a signal was given. The lead-weighted roof came crashing down. The mechanism worked, but not as planned. Crepareus Gallus was standing directly underneath and was crushed to death instantly. But the high sides of the couch that Agrippina was lying on were unexpectedly strong, and they held, protecting her and Asaronia from the full weight of the falling lead. The next part of the plan, the breaking apart of the ship, also failed. In their confusion, the sailors on board who were in on the plot struggled against those who were not. The ship listed heavily to one side. In the chaos, the quick-thinking Asaronia made a fatal mistake. Believing the rescuers would be looking for the emperor's mother, she began to cry out. The assassins on board, hearing her cries in the darkness, immediately set upon her with their oars and poles, clubbing her to death. Agrippina, meanwhile, remained silent. Though she had been wounded in the shoulder, she understood instantly what was happening. This was no accident. This was an execution. Silently, she slipped over the side of the tilting boat and into the dark water of the bay. In a final testament to her remarkable resilience, Agrippina, a 43-year-old woman with an injured shoulder, began to swim. She was eventually spotted by some fishing boats, pulled from the water, and taken to her villa. She had survived. Now, she knew the horrifying, undeniable truth. Her son, the boy she had placed on the throne, had tried to murder her. Back at Baiae, Nero was waiting anxiously for news of his mother's death. When a messenger arrived, breathless, to inform him that Agrippina had survived a terrible accident and was safely back in her villa, Nero was thrown into a state of sheer panic. His plan had failed, and now his mother knew everything. He was convinced she would seek revenge, that she would use her still considerable influence to turn the army and the people against him, exposing him as a matricide. He summoned his two most powerful advisors, Seneca and Burrus. According to Tacitus, the three men sat in stunned silence for a long time. They knew that if they did not act, Agrippina would. Burrus, the tough old soldier, refused to order his praetorians to kill the daughter of Germanicus. The loyalty of his men to that name was still too strong. It was Anicetus, the architect of the failed boat, who offered the solution. He told Nero that he would finish the job he had started. Nero, desperate, agreed. At her villa, Agrippina was also making her final moves. She sent a messenger to Nero, calmly informing him that, by the grace of the gods, she had survived a serious accident, and she urged him not to worry. It was a calculated message, a final attempt to see if there was any way out, to pretend she did not know the truth. She knew what was coming. She had the wound on her shoulder treated and had a list made of her property. Then, she waited. It wasn't long before Anicetus arrived, accompanied by 2 other officers. They surrounded the villa with soldiers and broke down the doors. They found the empress mother in her bedroom, with only a single maidservant by her side. When the maid saw the armed men, she fled. Agrippina calmly turned to face them and said, "If you have come to see me, you can tell the emperor I am recovered. If you have come to do a crime, I believe nothing of my son. He has not ordered his mother's murder." The assassins surrounded her bed. Anicetus was the first to strike, hitting her on the head with a club. As the others drew their swords, Agrippina, in a final defiant gesture, looked at her killers and pointed to her abdomen. She spoke her last famous words, "Ventrem feri," strike the womb. She was telling them to destroy the part of her that had given birth to such a monster. They stabbed her again and again until she was dead. The news was carried back to Nero. The immediate aftermath was terror. Roman historians say he spent the rest of the night in a state of shock, haunted by what he had done, terrified of the morning light. The official story put out by the palace was that Agrippina had been plotting against the emperor and, when her conspiracy was discovered, had taken her own life. The servile Senate dutifully accepted the story, even holding public thanksgiving ceremonies for the emperor's salvation. The murder of his mother would haunt Nero for the rest of his life. It was a turning point in his reign. With Agrippina gone, the last real restraint on his power and his paranoia was removed. His rule would descend further into tyranny and bloodshed. Agrippina's legacy remains one of the most complex and debated in Roman history. Was she a power-hungry monster who stopped at nothing, including incest and murder, to achieve her goals? Or was she a brilliant and courageous woman, a political genius who played a man's game better than any man, using the only tools available to her in a brutal world that had destroyed the rest of her family? Perhaps she was both. She was a survivor, a schemer, an empress maker, and ultimately a victim of her own success. Her life was a gripping drama of ambition and betrayal, and her death marked the true beginning of the end for the Julio-Claudian dynasty she had fought so hard to control. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.